Great. Good afternoon. Welcome to Senate Education Wednesday, February 15th, 1:30. We actually have a relatively abbreviated or somewhat light agenda, I think, today. We may be finished by 4. It's school safety. We're going to return to the walkthrough on S56, have more of a pre-K conversation, and then we're going to wrap up with school construction and have some responses to Senator Gulick's draft bill, which we went through yesterday, and I think we're going to generally hear, pretty good stuff in the endorsement. So I don't think folks are going to be very long. So with that, Barbara, do you mind joining us at the table? And we have Secretary French with us on screen. Secretary French, welcome back to Senate Ed and Director Barbic. We're here talking about school safety, with a particular eye to the school safety bill that we have before us. But really, first and foremost, a little bit of an update, any additional information you can provide around what happened last week, and any sort of lessons learned from that incident that we want to be thinking about as it relates to school safety bill going forward. So with that, the floor is yours.
Sure. Good afternoon, Dan French, Secretary of Education. Dee and I are really pleased to be invited back in on this topic, and certainly we had in our minds to provide you an update on last week's incident, though that analysis is still unfolding. But again, thank you for the opportunity to come in and testify on this very important topic. We're just going to provide some oral comments for you today and be happy to engage in question and answer. But as you know, we did bring forward some recommendations on how to improve our statutory framework for school safety back in January. We know the committee has taken a lot of testimony since then. And, firstly, just want to express our gratitude and appreciation for your interest in working on this important issue. In January, our testimony basically was around shifting well-established and what we'd characterize as well-resourced best practices that have been supported over the last decade or so. And our recommendation is essentially to shift from those practices being recommendations to making them more permanent requirements. And our main rationale for bringing forward this recommendation now really rests on this just assertion that only with a recommendation will we see consistently across the state an approach to school safety. Essentially, to summarize that, it's unacceptable in our view to have some schools be more safe than others. And it's only through a requirement that we can ensure that all schools are safe. Our proposal that we brought forth in January is still where we strongly encourage the committee to take action. The 4 requirement areas that we propose are options-based drills, the consistent approach to emergency operations planning, which Dee will talk about in a minute relative to what happened last week, requiring a policy on access control and visitor management. And lastly, sort of the newest innovation in this area is a requirement to maintain a behavior threat assessment team, which we think is really integral to getting out in front of a lot of these issues. I'd also just want to highlight, I don't think we've testified on yet, but we've also been working really from the inception of this work earlier in the fall with the understanding that the agency would be working on new regulations. And you might be familiar last year with the pupil weighting law. There was a requirement that the agency engage in the creation of what are called district quality standards, and also the articulation of a new quality assurance process. So we've embedded school safety in that regulatory work. We just filed with ICAR last week, so that should be on their agenda for their meeting later, I guess next week. But just want to reassure the committee that that regulatory approach, we've done it in mind of making these recommendations, and we think that regulatory approach will provide the necessary direction to the agency to adequately support and oversee the implementation of these requirements. But again, we think there is some urgency on this matter, and wanted to express our appreciation for your interest in working on this. And I would offer, particularly from the Agency of Education's perspective, as you work more towards finalizing a bill in this area, and offer our legislative counsel and our legal team support to work with you and your ledge counsel to come up with a really solid version of this law. But to underscore the urgency and the importance of it, I'll turn it over to Dee now, who will, as you know, heads up the Governor's Task Force on Violence Prevention, and will make some remarks regarding the incident last week relative to this broader body of work. All yours, Dee.
Before we do that, yeah, does anybody have any questions for Secretary French? And the one note I have, and correct me if I'm wrong, Senator Kulik, you were wondering about teacher training. Like, I think it came up in this conversation that, you know, teachers aren't coming to the table. They're coming to teach French, math, whatever, and there's a training component or something in it that some teachers might not want to be a part of. Does that make sense, Secretary French?
Yeah, maybe to a certain extent. I think, you know, the experience I've had over the years, I think when I came in January, you know, my career as a teacher, then a principal, superintendent, I've seen this work evolve over the years. I haven't had direct experience as a school level leader with the threat assessment process. That's sort of something that's been evolving in the last couple of years. But I will say, in terms of the all hazards sort of planning and the options based drills, we don't think about different classes of employees or different types of employees. It's really for all employees. It's everyone needs to be involved in that, whether you're a custodian or a teacher. So there isn't specific training relative to your type of status, other than you might be in charge of a classroom and so forth. But again, from our perspective, there's been a lot of professional development resources offered on this. To the extent, like anything we do in the state, that it trickles down to an individual teacher saying, well, I'm unaware of it. We think, again, that just underscores the need to make this a requirement so there is greater consistency and implementation across the state.
Okay, thank you for that. Yes. I don't know.
Oh, yeah, I'll speak to it. Thank you for being here. I think one of the testimonies that we took at one point was around having a more, or suggesting a trauma-informed methodology. And I just kind of wanted to second that. I do remember we had an ALICE training, I believe, or Run, Hide, Fight at Essex High School. And I do remember that video was quite intense and triggering for some folks, for sure. It was also extremely loud, which didn't help. But I guess I would just second the motion of really thinking about sort of trauma-informed practices when you're putting together whatever it is you're going to put together. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Senator. And I will say this, the idea of really, you're speaking about the options-based drills. That has evolved a lot as the threats have evolved. What I see now in sort of best practice in that area is far more responsive to sort of the social emotional impact on the practitioners than it was originally. Like a lot of things, you know, we're reacting to certain circumstances to make our schools safe. But I think there's been more effort put into thinking about the impact of the practitioners. I also think, you know, it's one of the reasons I really strongly support the behavior threat management approach, because that really gets into, it really starts on the premise of social psychology and from an assets perspective, how to support people, how to support students in particular. So I think, you know, I think all this work is evolving. Again, I don't necessarily think it will not continue to evolve absent a change here, but I think it's really important by moving to a requirement, we get some consistency around common language, so we don't have people using old versions of how to do this. We can really stay consistent across the state and evolve together. That's really important with our professional development, that we have a common language when we bring people together. And if you're familiar, everything we do in Vermont, when it's a local decision, we end up half the time when we bring people together is just doing the translation of like, well, in your district, it means this, and in this district, it means that. So it's really important that we move towards common language that I think a requirement would enable us to do.
Oh, yes, I agree. And I do consider myself a tough broad, and I did lose my father to gun violence. So I am, you know, I'm extremely sensitive to any kind of media that's like over sensationalized,
Sure.
which is what what we had that day. So anyway, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
So, yeah, Dee, if you want to run with it for a bit.
And for the record, my name is Dee Barbic. I'm the Director of Violence Prevention. To just move along from what Secretary French had started off with in his testimony. Again, our goals here are consistency, common language, and that all of our schools are able to have the same level of safety across the board. And again, the 4 areas that we're looking to address is options-based drills, the policy on visitor management, that schools implement an emergency operations plan that's at least as comprehensive as the template that's provided by the Vermont School Safety Center, and the behavioral threat assessment teams for supervisory unions and districts. With the experience that we had last week with the hoax calls, I think that really brought to light some of the points that we're making with this proposal, and that emergency operations plans were critical in dealing with those kinds of situations. And part of emergency operations plans include communications, a huge part of that, and how critical those communications are. Visitor management, again, ensuring that the schools were secured had these been, in fact, actual events. And then the options-based drills, so that schools were able to make a decision, take options that were most reasonable under the circumstances wherever that school was in the state. And again, as you know, we saw these throughout the state in a variety of different areas. In terms of the actual hoax calls from last week, there have been some debriefings. We're actually having another one this afternoon. And our goal is to understand where any gaps exist and identify those and how we can make improvements. We need to use these as a learning platform. So, thank goodness that none of these were actual events. However, I think that we can use it as a tool to make our systems better, make our schools safer. And with that, we need to understand the responses that each school made in collaboration with the law enforcement response. Again, that communication, where things, could have been done better, how things went very well. And I think when we look into each of these incidents, my expectation will be that we'll see a variety along that platform. And that's what we are exactly looking to alleviate through our proposal, is that all schools have a plan in place that can respond to a variety of emergencies. Again, this one was the hoax calls on the shooter, but as I mentioned in past testimony, it could be anything from electrical outages to fires to a number of different incidents. So, we want to identify also our ability to identify hoax calls in the future. So I think, again, we will look to do an assessment of each of these 22 incidents more closely. But, communication being key is understanding that after receiving a number of very similar calls, we start to, say, okay, this seems a little odd, out of the ordinary. But I also, importantly, is to ensure that our response to those doesn't diminish just because there's an assumption, oh, this might be a hoax. So every one of these calls law enforcement did respond to them. Law enforcement did go to the schools and ensure that, in fact, there was not an active shooter. So, we want to, again, do an assessment, ensure how we can make improvements in how responses were to these particular cases.
Senator Hershey.
Can I just ask a question
Sure.
about the hoax calls? And if you can't speak to this, I fully understand. But from my perspective, one of my biggest concerns is that it almost seemed like a coordinated effort to stress test the system. And I was wondering, is this something that's also happened in other states recently, or it is?
Yeah, during the summer or later part of the summer and in the fall, we were made aware of other states that were experiencing, I can't name them off the top of my head, but we were aware that other states were experiencing hoax calls of a similar nature. And so we were aware and prepared to a degree that, hey, this is happening in other states. So to my knowledge, in the last month or so, I'm not aware of any other states that were experiencing these hoax calls. We then got ours, and my understanding is that there were other states the same day or within a couple of days who were also experiencing the same thing.
Yeah, it's to me, that's even more concerning than a 13-year-old playing a prank. But yeah, I was just curious. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to Senator Epstein's question that I did some visits on Monday to county schools, the supervisory level, and they were actually aware of the fact that other states had had a hoax, or at least they had a sensitization of such a unusual event.
Yeah.
And I think the important thing too is that with that knowledge, the response was still the same. So not making an assumption that, oh, this must just be a hoax, that there was a response as there should have been for each of these.
So you felt confident, across the board that the response was consistent and quick, as you would have hoped.
Yes.
And
And
that's not so much our purview, law enforcement, but you feel you were pleased.
yeah, with the, we were in communication, direct communication with Department of Public Safety, with the commissioner and the colonel, and we were assured that there was a law enforcement response to each of the incidents. And I feel, that was handled quite well.
Yeah.
Thank you. Once you have your debrief and you've had time to sort of put your thoughts together, can we be rebriefed as
Yes.
well?
Yes.
That'd be great.
Great. Do you have a timing on that?
I'm
A timing, a sense of when sort of the next stage of like the work that you're doing to understand what happened?
I will know more after we meet this afternoon,
Okay.
but right now I don't.
Senator Williams?
So in a former life, we had what we call standard operating procedures. And safety is everybody's business, school safety is, but when everybody's looking at it, nobody in particular is looking at it. What agency is the head agency to establish a standard operating procedure in a situation with a school, like what we just experienced? Does everybody have a common language? For example, what the secretary said, is there anything in writing as it starts at the top and gets driven down to the local school? Then the SOPs could expound upon different situations with unique situations that the schools might have. And do we have any such thing as an SOP?
So in terms of if I understand your question, so the schools, what we're proposing here is that every school have an SOP, or what we call an emergency operations plan, on how to deal with a variety of situations. And part of that is that they also collaborate with their local emergency management, so their town. So they're working very closely together, and the town okay, this is the communication if there is an emergency at the school, and then they have collaborated. The town is aware of what the school's emergency operation plan is. So from that perspective, that's our goal, is that every school has these in place so that they are prepared to deal with these.
So what
situations.
I'm suggesting is it be top driven, maybe Department of Public Safety, because I was the emergency management coordinator in my town, and we had a lockdown in our high school, and nobody in the town government knew about it.
Mhm.
So there's got to be communication that's got to go laterally, up and down, and it should start at the top and be driven to the local level.
And
Yeah,
yes,
I-
absolutely.
I was going to chime in, Senator. That's, I think, the intention of what we're proposing to a certain extent. But just to echo on Dee's previous comment, we have, this long established partnership we call the Vermont School Safety Center, which is a joint partnership between Department of Public Safety and the Agency of Education. That is sort of the source of truth, if you will, in terms of the templates of the planning and so forth. But because it's a recommendation, people take that template out and do different things with it. And we don't have a lot of visibility into the quality of the emergency operation plans. Essentially, what this proposal will do in conjunction with the district quality standards, it makes it a regulatory approach supervised by the Agency of Education. So we would, the Agency of Education is not expected to have public safety expertise. We would still rely on our state partners and our outside resources to develop these models, but we would, by making it a requirement, then bring it into a more stronger regulatory approach, and we'd have a definitive oversight of that coming from the Agency of Education.
And following up on Senator Williams' question, so yeah, this bill will do it, and then we're all thinking about the other external coordinations that are, happening.
And that will be part of our conversation this afternoon as well.
Thank you.
And I don't think any of that work ever goes away.
Sure.
That's the piece that has to be practiced and the professional development, but we're eliminating one variable by creating a requirement here, and that we're all working from the same recipe, if you will, as opposed to having the potential for 200 different recipes out in the landscape. So if people are working from a common template and then taking that template in the context of their specific ecosystem to consider what their specific resources are and so forth, it still provides us with a real solid basis for convening professional development and providing technical support.
And another key part of that is that in the proposal that schools reevaluate that every year annually. And again, there's so many things change, there may be a change in the structure of the school or an addition of classrooms or a whole variety of things. So having them review the EOPs annually and take into consideration those changes and make those modifications is really important as well.
I think also, just to add on to this, we're likely to experience a period of increased staffing volatility in the education system. So anytime we see people turning over in key leadership positions, as we are now, it just underscores for me the importance of having SOPs, of having standardized practices, because if we rely on individuals to bring this work forward and people are turning over in key positions, there's a real potential that this could get lost. To Dee's point, this needs to be looked at annually. By creating that as sort of a requirement, then we're insulating ourselves from the volatility of the staffing patterns that are likely to be a part of our future as an education system.
Just one more point. I'm trying to find out, when you develop an SOP, everybody will copy it. There's certain things that everybody has to do. That way, if you go to another school, they should be able to go to that school emergency SOP and know where they're supposed to go when this happens. And I'm not sure that the administration even has a plan to make that happen.
Well, I think that's partly, correct me if I'm wrong, that is ideally, if we pass this, then if I'm teaching math at one school, I'll get the same training, I get transferred to another school, I'll be able to have it's basically the same kind of, I'll be ready to roll.
Correct. And as the secretary had mentioned, it's utilizing the same template. There are going to have to be minor changes because each school is a little bit different, but that basic template, that basic plan will be the same.
Okay, I'll get off it.
No, it's a really, it's a good question. And it's a key question and it's a key goal and all this. Can you just say a couple words for my own understanding of what exactly happened with this situation? When you're talking about swatting, the only thing I can think of, and I'll just show it's almost like a robocall kind of thing. But is that sort of what's going out? Somebody's hitting something on a computer. It's heading out. A message is heading out to all these places. Phones are ringing. They're picking up and they're hearing some kind of message.
It can happen in a number of different ways. In this case, my understanding is that it wasn't a computer generated voice.
Okay.
So it wasn't sort of the robocall, like when you get the computerized voice on your cell phone robocall kind of thing, call this number
right.
for give us your credit card information,
Or
what have you.
vote for Campus.
Um,
One of
so,
those.
yeah, so my understanding is that from that respect, it wasn't like a computerized voice. In terms of the technicality of how these work, I'm not sort of a phone IT person, but my understanding is that there are ways that the actual location can be concealed by bouncing these calls off of a
VPN.
variety of different places, and they become very difficult to track down. Our partners with the FBI are also involved in the investigation, so that they have the tools and the ability to do more work in that area. But again, it's very difficult to track the where those calls originated from.
Did you say VPN?
Yeah, the virtual private network,
Yeah.
it can, it's how people access the dark web is through a VPN, and then it bounces to a IP address in Switzerland, and then Brazil, and then Guatemala, and then, goes to the website address.
So has there been success out there generally to track these groups down, or is it just so hard?
I know that it's very difficult, and I don't know what the success rate is.
Any other questions?
If I could just add one last thing, in testimony a couple of weeks ago, there was some conversation about the behavioral threat assessments and the training
Yeah.
and a little bit more information about those. And I would offer to have Dr. Marissa Randazzo testify remotely, and she is a subject matter expert in behavioral threat assessments, and she has started she's a psychiatrist, and she is basically one of the most, and she's actually done trainings for us in Vermont for schools and administrators on behavioral threat assessment, and was also doing a very fantastic presentation at the Governor's School Safety Conference in the fall. And she is more than willing to testify remotely and give an overview of behavioral threat assessments and answer any questions you have related to that. And I think it's great to have her come in if you have the availability and the time, given that she does do trainings for us here in Vermont. So she is, the person we go to for those kinds of things.
Yeah, and her name is on the list, and I couldn't remember when I saw the name who she was. So yes, thanks for
That'd be great.
bringing that up, Leander.
Thank you.
Hopefully have her in next week if she can do it.
Okay,
Great.
thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your work. Secretary French, thanks for your work. I know it was a crazy couple of days for all of you last week. So can't even imagine.
Thank you for your time.
All right,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Is Beth zooming or is she in? All right, Beth will be here in a second.
Cole? Yeah. Why do I sound like that?